I'm David Bank, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
When we now design for our mobilization facilities, those investment structures, we want to be able to replicate it, because if you can replicate it, then you can scale it.
That's Leslie Maasdorp, CEO of British International Investment, or BII. On the job about a year, he's charting a 5-year plan for the UK's development finance institution, built around climate finance, de-risking investments in emerging markets, and innovative approaches that can crowd in private capital at scale. Let's jump into our conversation. Leslie Maasdorp, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
I've been very excited about this call. It's coming up, I think, on your 1-year anniversary there at BII, and also at the same time, the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. And you've been very vocal and outspoken and taken a kind of leadership role, I think, in staking out the need for mobilizing capital for climate. And I'd love it if you could give us a kind of landscape of where we stand, and then we can get into what BII is doing and how you see it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, David. I think a good starting point is exactly that we are now, as you said, celebrating or witnessing the 10th anniversary of the very historic Paris Agreement, which was the first legally binding climate agreement that the world agreed to, as you know. Now, a sort of cursory glance at the sort of state of climate finance or the state of development finance would suggest that there's been a massive retreat, or maybe a few steps taken backwards over the last year, as countries began to apparently sort of deprioritize the climate agenda, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, Net Zero Insurance Alliance. The sort of general commitment to net zero seems to have been receding, companies talking less about net zero and 2050. I mean, I would submit that there's been considerable changes over the last 10 years, way too much for us in the limited time we have now to analyze. But in broad terms, I would say that the general momentum, firstly, the scientific consensus around the climate emergency, the political will and commitment of certainly the UK government, which is the sort of serious or the material shareholder of BII. There's a strong commitment by all the leading industrialized countries that climate change is real, and that we have to ensure that we do not have a reversal of the development gains, the gains in the development agenda for the last couple of decades that can be eroded if we do not address climate change. And I would argue that today, there's been a lot of introspection by the development finance system. There's been considerable financial innovation, whether it's in the form of blended finance structures. There's a lot more innovation around risk mitigation, use of local currency offerings, ways in which to mitigate foreign exchange risk. There's so much innovation that have taken place to make sure that we're retooling the development finance system to adjust to the new external context. That new external context is about less resources, less capital availability, but it's also about reconfiguring how we use available resources in a more effective manner.
Well, let me just pause you on that and say, well, maybe situate, the role of development finance, because what we're seeing, and I think what you've just put your finger on, is that as obviously, AID in the US and foreign aid generally retreats, that there actually is a lane or obviously a more increased urgency, but also increased opportunities for private capital to come in. And there's kind of a split screen where the policies in some cases is going one direction, but the economics of these projects and these deals going in the other direction, and they become the least cost energy and the way to expand capacity, which is on everybody's mind. So how do DFIs or development finance institutions like BII play in that context?
You're absolutely right. So at one level, we have taken a few steps backwards with, the dismantling of the aid architecture when USAID was effectively sort of shut down in February this year. But as you just correctly articulated, there's also been a significant reduction in the cost or the technologies that define the sort of energy transition, whether it's the cost of solar panels, battery storage, wind power, on all dimensions. The cost curve is in favor of the energy transition. So it makes good economic sense there's a massive commercial opportunity in the energy transition. So as we are seeking to mobilize more private sector capital, it's just good common sense, real economic opportunity for your pension funds, your asset managers, your institutional investors. If it was the other way around, if it was more expensive, if fossil fuels were cheaper, then we would have had a real material sort of challenge. So the momentum is still behind the climate change movement, and the majority of the industrialized world, as I said earlier on, remains committed and is providing leadership on climate.
That seems to be true at a broad level, but then I think when you
Mm.
get down to specific projects, risk factors crop up.
Yeah.
Whether that's in certain markets, certain currency risks, certain offtake, security, and the real nitty gritty of doing deals. I think that's where development finance institutions can come in and try to play kind of a catalytic role of risk reduction and crowd in commercial capital. Does that actually work?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I would say firstly that there remain significant risk factors in a number of markets, especially in your low income and more riskier, let's take Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Many of these countries, in terms of credit worthiness, they're either sub-investment grade or they're unrated. Many institutional investors are unable, for fiduciary reasons, they're unable to invest in those markets. However, there are fast-growing economies in Asia, whether it be India, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. Many of these economies have a significant decarbonization challenge, meaning they have to move away from very coal-intensive energy systems. And we can do that today at a very cost-effective way with much cheaper technologies to bring more clean energy to those markets. You are spot on in saying that it is not a uniform story. Many of the markets in Africa face a more challenging uphill situation because in Africa, the issue is more about energy access. There's still energy poverty. Most of sub-Saharan Africa, we still have 550 to 600 million people who do not have access to affordable, consistent supply of electricity. So it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. However, I was suggesting that the energy transition in Asia, in particular, presents a strong commercial opportunity for the entire development finance system.
Let's talk about BII specifically and how you kind of see the opportunities. I was taken that I think in pounds, you put in something like or deployed something like 700 plus million pounds. That's something like $900 million into climate finance last year, up from 80 million pounds or $100 million back in 2020. So in 4 years, 9xing, not quite 10xing. People sometimes talk about 10x, getting a 10x, but you 9xed your climate investment, and I think it's still going up. So you're thinking this fits obviously BII's investment criteria, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Let me just start by saying that the UK, starting from 2015 at COP, the UK played a very important role in the Paris Agreement and also in codifying the SDGs. The UK continued to play that leadership role, as you know, in COP21, which was really about the financing of the climate agenda. And at that stage, with my predecessor, they were given a mandate to have 30% of all the commitments every year to be focused on climate. In practice, last year, for example, where we did $2.1 billion of investments, 41%, meaning we significantly exceeded the 30% target, was already in the climate domain. I guess the key point to make there is that the UK has given its DFI, BII, the mandate to continue to raise the bar and ambition on climate. We are currently in the middle of our new 5-year strategy, and it is very likely that we will continue on this path of setting higher targets in terms of our focus on climate.
And just to make the point clear, you still have hurdles and mandates in terms of returns and risk expectations and whatnot. And so you're finding that you can align your climate investment strategies and your broader financial goals?
Absolutely. So BII, like many of the DFIs, we've got this twin mandate. We are focused on development impact. We've got a very sophisticated set of methodologies where we assess every investment at a deal level and at a portfolio level. We want to make sure that those investments enhance, whether it be the employment of women, whether it be the hiring of young people, supporting small and medium enterprises, reducing carbon emissions. So we've got a sophisticated framework to assess the development impact of those investments. But at the same time, we need a commercial return, David. In order for us to continue to what we do, all of these impact businesses that we invest in have to be financially sustainable. So it's a fine balancing act, but it has to be underpinned by strong commercial logic. So we only invest in businesses that are sustainable, that has at least the ingredients of financial sustainability. It might be a very modest return, but a return nevertheless. Obviously, in some other markets, so we operate largely in Asia, countries like India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal, and so on. And then we invest in sub-Saharan Africa. In many of the Asian countries, you're able to derive higher commercial returns because of the much more developed nature of some of those markets, bigger commercial opportunities. And we are now looking at increasing our focus on what I mentioned earlier on private capital mobilization. We want to see to what extent we can be more catalytic. We can crowd in more institutional investor capital, especially in those markets in the faster growing Asian economies.
I was taken by a kind of contest or challenge you put out in January with Mercer to I think commit something like 50 million pounds to a new mobilization facility. And you sort of asked to crowdsource the innovation on that. So I imagine you got some interested folks
Absolutely.
for that mandate. How's it looking?
For the last decade or so that I've been involved in development finance, I've often found that, you have these bifurcated conversations where the institutional investor community, they sit in one set of rooms, the development finance institutions in another. So BII, when the Prime Minister announced a £100 million mobilization facility, instead of us deciding how would we deploy this £100 million, we thought, let's get a conversation going with big institutions, whether it be Ashmore, Brookfield, Amundi, Prudential, all of these institutions, and crowdsource ideas from them. So we received 27 proposals from some of the largest institutions in the world. We narrowed it down to 5. We are now in the final process of consolidating the best ideas, which we hope to have announced by COPO during the course of November. So we've made great strides in using all of those ideas coming from the institutional investor community to pick what are the best-in-class ideas of how we can make that 100 million and make it 5x, meaning this is an experimentation. It's kind of a laboratory that we're in to see next time if we have another mobilization facility, what can we learn to build on from what has been achieved.
I'm guessing you don't want to scoop yourself on who the winner is, but give us a taste of what's the kind of thing that could actually ramp up capital, and as you say, from big institutions, which you're looking at, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance funds.
There's a number of elements here. I think the first point to make is that as DFIs, we have to play a greater role to de-risk a lot of these investments. Now, a lot of the institutional investors would be very willing to invest alongside us if some of these barriers are removed. Now, it does not mean we are subsidizing the private capital to come into these deals. What we mean is we want to use the catalytic piece or the junior equity piece in such a way that it can improve the risk return profile of a particular project, which can then make it more conducive for them. Because of their fiduciary mandate, they've got to achieve X amount of return. We can then crowd in 4-5 times what would ordinarily not have been achieved without that sort of concessional piece. So, and I can't say much more about the specifics of these proposals because they're currently, being reviewed by our investment committee. And I'm very pleased by the fact that we've got some of the largest institutions in the world who will be working alongside us to mobilize through these structures.
I think you had a sort of a memorable quote at one point about wanting to mobilize $9 of commercial capital for every $1 of catalytic versus $1 of commercial for every $9 of catalytic.
The DFI system have been on this path for at least the last decade, David. In 2015, Also, in the same year that the SDGs were announced, the same year that the Paris Agreement was announced, there was this private sector for development summit that took place in Ethiopia, and the famous billions to trillions narrative was born. So the idea of mobilizing private sector capital really is a decade old. So we've made great strides over the last decade in coming up with blended finance structures, coming up with a common language, common frameworks, common methodologies, so that we are able to move the entire system towards mobilizing private sector capital. There's still a lot of obstacles. For example, we have not really succeeded to standardize these blended finance structures that we have come up with. They're too bespoke. So, for example, when we now design the for our mobilization facilities, those investment structures, we want to be able to replicate it, because if you can replicate it, then you can scale it and you can repeat the financial instruments in such a manner that it becomes easy and the transaction cost is low. At the moment, what we have is it can take an awfully long time to structure these deals. I'll give you an example. A week ago, the World Bank announced, or rather the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, announced a $510 million transaction, a securitization deal, with the first of its kind by the World Bank. And what they're able to do is to sort of bundle IFC loans into securities, which they can then on-sell to the private sector. The key point I want to make is it took them 2 years to structure that deal. That's an awfully long time. Commercial institutions do not have the sort of patience and the capacity to wait so long. But we are now in a process of getting greater standardization, greater sort of harmonization, so that we are able to replicate these structures.
Well, that leads me to ask you about what I know you're working on, a new 5-year strategy for BII that will take us to 2030, which was and is the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals, as you mentioned, and there were various markers and milestones on the way to net zero as well. Tell us what your strategy is to get us there, and then also whether you think we're going to meet those kind of goals.
Sure. I mean, I think that the broad strategic priorities that will inform our next strategy, I can define around sort of three cornerstones. And the first one is the increased ambition on climate, meaning we will devote, up to probably 50% of our annual commitments to climate finance in our markets of operation. Linked to that is the desire to ensure that we deploy our capital in such a way that we can mobilize considerable amounts of private sector capital. So the first big sort of piece of the strategy is just about demonstrating the increased focus on climate and making sure that we become more catalytic. The second key priority, I would say, is around our commitment to low-income countries and or the least developed countries, or frontier markets, as is often called. BII has really distinguished itself, David, over several decades to be the leading investor in equity in some of the markets that many institutions consider uninvestable. We invest in markets like Sierra Leone, Burundi, Ethiopia. These are often defined as frontier markets. And we've been successful in doing this because, we work with local intermediaries. We have very strong business integrity sort of teams assessing every sort of transaction, every company very, very closely. We focus on partnerships in these markets. We ensure also that we are able to work closely with the governments and regulators to effect the kind of regulatory and policy changes that can create a better investment environment. So a continued focus on the least developed countries in Africa is also going to be a big focus for us, because the government has signaled that whilst it wants to play a leadership role in climate, it does not want to do so at the expense of the African continent, which, as you know, remains the least developed of continents in the world. I mean, just to reference one number for you, 600 million people on the continent do not have access to electricity. Forget about talks about AI and technology. If you don't have power, you're unable to lit up a school, or have access to hospitals and healthcare and so on. So the foundational infrastructure in these frontier markets is something that BII is very focused on. So it's climate, it's mobilization, it's frontier markets. And as I said earlier on, we want to use the potential of new financial innovation to retool or to enhance our toolkit. We cannot just do the same because we're now entering an era of greater capital constraints. Most of the development finance institutions in the world, including multilateral development banks, they're all facing with a situation where they've got to optimize on their balance sheets, look at ways to become more effective with their existing capital. So there's a lot of innovation that is underneath that sort of headline of optimizing on our balance sheets.
And just to press you, actually, 2030s will be the end point of this 5 years. Will we have met many or some of or any of the Sustainable Development Goals, and where will we be on climate and decarbonization?
But that is $1 million question. And if I had the answer to look into a crystal ball, I would say that some progress would have made by 2030, but by no means would we be able to sort of tick the box on all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. What we have, though, achieved is much greater sort of alignment within the development finance system about what reforms are needed in order to have a bigger, better and more effective development finance world. I think the era of being more capital constrained is forcing us to be more innovative, and you will see more and more sort of announcements over the next sort of about 12 months. All of my peers that I speak to, the CEOs of European DFIs, the World Bank has got a private sector lab. I've interacted with them. They are working on so many, and already a number of announcements have been made. We're going to make much more use, for example, of guarantees, simplify the procedures. We're looking at all kinds of ways to streamline and enhance the speed of execution. We've been too process-driven. Our deals to take too long. They are too bespoke. So there's a lot of internal sort of, Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank, calls it kind of fixing the plumbing of the institutions. We are doing a lot of that just to simplify, streamline, so that it becomes easier for your big commercial institutions to work with us. To give you one example, David, each of our institutions have climate policies. We have policies on gender equity and diversity and so on. We have policies on risk management. All of our policies are broadly the same, but there are important differences, which means that for investee companies, they have to comply with reporting requirements that are different. So if we invest alongside Norfund in Norway or FMO in Holland, investee company will have duplicate sort of requirements to provide reports. That is really sort of now going to become obsolete, where we are aiming to streamline all of these, harmonize our frameworks so that it becomes a much more simplified and easier process to deal with the DFI system.
Well, Leslie, I very much appreciate your pragmatic optimism, and I'm delighted to see that a year in and a tumultuous one at that, you still have the enthusiasm and the vision that you came in with. And we're going to be watching closely and covering all of these deals and developments. So come back and join us again, if you will.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Big thanks to Leslie, to our producer Isaac Silk, to the whole team at Impact Alpha, and to all of you Agents of Impact, with gratitude for all that you do.